The Ancient City, Book 4, Chapter 7, Third Revolution. The Plebs enter the city. 3. History of this revolution at Rome. At Rome, the plebs had a great influence at an early date. The situation of the city, between the Latins, the Sabines, and the Etruscans, condemned it to perpetual war, and war required that there should be a numerous population. The kings, therefore, had welcomed and invited all foreigners without regard to their origin. Wars succeeded each other without intermission, and as there was a need of men, the most common result of every victory was to take away the inhabitants of the conquered city and transfer them to Rome. What became of these men, brought with the booty? If there were found among them patrician and priestly families, the patricians hastened to associate them with themselves. As to the multitude, some of them became the clients of the great, or of the king, and a part were left with the plebs. Still other elements entered into the composition of this class. Many foreigners flocked to Rome as a place whose situation rendered it convenient for commerce. The discontented among the Sabines, the Etruscans, and the Latins found a refuge there. All this class joined the plebs. The client who succeeded in escaping from the gens became a plebeian. The patrician who formed a misalliance, or was guilty of any crime that lost him his rank, fell into the inferior class. Every bastard was cast out by religion from pure families and counted among the plebs. For all these reasons the plebs increased in numbers. The struggle which had begun between the patricians and the king increased their importance. The kings and the plebs early felt that they had the same enemies. The ambition of the kings was to cut loose from the old principles of government, which limited the exercise of their power. The ambition of the plebeians was to break the ancient barriers which excluded them from the religious and political associations. A tacit alliance was established. The kings protected the plebs, and the plebs sustained the kings. The traditions and testimony of antiquity place the great progress of the plebeians under the reign of Servius. The hatred which the patricians preserved for this king sufficiently shows what his policy was. His first reform was to give lands to the plebeians, not, it is true, in the Ager Romanus, but in the territory taken from the enemy. Still, this conferring the right to own land upon families that had previously cultivated only the fields of others was none the less an innovation. What was graver still was that he published laws for the plebs, which had never been done before. These laws, for the most part, related to obligations which the plebeian might contract with the patrician. It was the commencement of a common law between the two orders, and for the plebs it was the commencement of equality. Later, this same king established a new division in the city. Without destroying the three ancient tribes, where the patrician families and clients were classed according to rank, he formed 4 new tribes, in which the entire population was distributed according to residence. We have seen this reform at Athens, and we know what were its effects. They were the same at Rome. The plebeians, who did not enter the ancient tribes, were admitted into the new ones. This multitude, up to that time a floating mass, a species of nomadic population that had no connection with the city, had henceforth its fixed divisions and its regular organization. The formation of these tribes, in which the two orders were mingled, really marked the entrance of the plebs into the city. Every tribe had a hearth and sacrifices. Servius established lares in every public place in the city, in every district of the country. They served as divinities for those who had no rank. The plebeians celebrated the religious festivals of his quarter and of his burg, Compitalia, Paganalia, as the patrician celebrated the sacrifice of his gens and of his curie. The plebeian had a religion. At the same time, a great change took place in the sacred ceremony of the lustration. The people were no longer ranged by curies, to the exclusion of those whom the curies did not admit. All the free inhabitants of Rome, all those who formed a part of the new tribes, figured in the sacred act. For the first time, all men, without distinction of patrician or client or plebeian, were united. The king walked around this mixed assembly, driving victims before him and singing solemn hymns. The ceremony finished, all alike found themselves citizens. Before Servius, only two classes of men were distinguished at Rome: the sacerdotal caste of patricians with their clients, and the plebeian class. No other distinction was known than that which religion had established. Servius marked a new division, which had wealth for its foundation. He divided the inhabitants of Rome into two great categories. In the one were those who owned property, and the other those who had nothing. The first was divided into 5 classes, in which men were divided off according to the amount of their fortune. By this means, Servius introduced an entirely new principle into Roman society. Wealth began to indicate rank, as religion had done before. Servius applied this division of the Roman population to military service. Before him, if the plebeians fought, it was not in the ranks of the legion. But as Servius had made proprietors and citizens of them, he could also make them legionaries. From this time the army was no longer composed of men exclusively from the curies. All free men, all those at least who had property, made a part of it, and the poor alone continued to be excluded. The rank of patrician or client no longer determined the armor of each soldier and his post in battle. The army was divided by classes, exactly like the population, according to wealth. The first class, which had complete armor, and the 2 following, which had at least the shield, the helmet, and the sword, formed the first 3 lines of the legion. The 4th and the 5th, being light armed, made up the body of skirmishers and slingers. Each class was divided into companies, called centuries. The first of these consisted, we are told, of 80 men. The 4 others 20 or 30 each. The cavalry was a separate body, and in this arm also Servius made a great innovation. Whilst up to that time the young patricians alone made up the centuries of the knights, Servius admitted a certain number of plebeians, chosen from the wealthiest, to fight on horseback, and formed of these 12 new centuries. Now, the army could not be touched without at the same time modifying the political constitution. The plebeians felt that their importance in the state had increased. They had arms, discipline, and chiefs. Every century had its centurion and its sacred ensign. This military organization was permanent. Peace did not dissolve it. The soldiers, it is true, on their return from a campaign, quitted their ranks, as the law forbade them to enter the city in military order. But afterwards, at the first signal, the citizens resumed their arms in the Campus Martius, where each returned to his century, his centurion, and his banner. Now it happened 25 years after Servius Tullius. The army was called together without any intention of making a military expedition. The army being assembled, and the men having taken their ranks, every century having its centurion at its head, and its ensign in the center, the magistrates spoke, proposed laws, and took a vote. The 6 patrician centuries and the 12 of the plebeian knights voted first. After them the centuries of infantry of the first class, and the others in turn. Thus was established, in a short time, the comitia centuriata, where every soldier had the right of suffrage, and where the plebeian and the patrician were hardly distinguished. All these reforms made a singular change in the appearance of the Roman city. The patricians remained, with their hereditary worship, their curies, their senate. But the plebeians became accustomed to independence, wealth, arms, and religion. The plebs were not confounded with the patricians, but became strong by the side of them. The patricians, it is true, took their revenge. They commenced by killing Servius. Later, they banished Tarquin. The defeat of royalty was the defeat of the plebs. The patricians attempted to take away from them all the conquests which they had made under the kings. One of the first acts was to take from them the lands that Servius had given them. And we must remark, the only reason given for despoiling them thus was that they were plebeians. The patricians therefore restored the old principle, which required that hereditary religion alone should establish the right of property, and which did not permit a man without religion and without ancestors to exercise any right over the soil. The laws that Servius had made for the plebs were also withdrawn. If the system of classes and the comitia centuriata were not abolished by the patricians, it was because the state of war did not allow them to disorganize the army, and also because they understood how to surround the comitia with formalities such that they could always control the elections. They dared not take from the plebs the title of citizens, and allowed them to figure in the census. But it is clear that, while allowing the plebs to form a part of the city, they shared with them neither political rights, nor religion, nor the laws. In name, the plebs remained in the city. In fact, they were excluded. Let us not unreasonably accuse the patricians, or suppose that they coldly conceived the design of oppressing and crushing the plebs. The patrician who was descended from a sacred family and felt himself the heir to a worship understood no other social system than that whose rules had been traced by the ancient religion. In his eyes, the constituent element of every society was the gens, with its worship, its hereditary chief, and its clientship. For him, the city could not be anything except an assembly of the chiefs of the gentes. It did not enter his mind that there could be any other political system than that which rested upon worship, or other magistrates than those who performed the public sacrifices, or other laws than those whose sacred formulas religion had dictated. It was useless to say to him that the plebeians also had within a short time adopted a religion, and that they offered sacrifices to the lares of the public squares. He would reply that this religion had not the essential character of a real religion, that it was not hereditary, that the fires were not ancient fires, and that these lares were not real ancestors. He would have added that the plebeians, in adopting a worship, had done what they had no right to do, and to obtain one had violated all principle, that they had taken only the external forms of worship, and had neglected the essential principle. It was not hereditary. That, in fine, this image of religion was absolutely the opposite of religion. Since the patrician persisted in thinking that hereditary religion alone should govern men, it followed that he saw no religion possible for the plebs. He could not understand how the social power could be regularly exercised upon this class of men. The sacred law could not be applied to them. Justice was sacred ground, which was forbidden to them. So long as there had been kings, they had taken upon themselves to govern the plebs, and they had done this according to certain rules, which had nothing in common with the ancient religion, and which necessity or the public interest had produced. But by the revolution which had abolished royalty, religion had assumed its empire. It necessarily followed that the whole plebeian class were placed beyond the reach of social laws. The patricians then established a government conformable to their own principles. But they had not dreamed of establishing one for the plebs. The patricians had not the courage to drive the plebeians from Rome, but they no longer found the means of organizing them into a regular society. We thus see, in the midst of Rome, thousands of families for which there existed no fixed laws, no social order, no magistrates. The city, the populace, that is to say, the patrician society, with the client that had remained to it, arose, powerful, organized, majestic. About it lived a plebeian multitude, which was not a people and did not form a body. The consuls, the chiefs of the patrician city, maintained order in this confused population. The plebeians obeyed. Feeble, generally poor, they bent under the power of the patrician body. The problem that was to decide the future of Rome was this: how can the plebs become a regular society? Now, the patricians, governed by the rigorous principles of their religion, saw only one means of resolving this problem. This was to adopt the plebs as clients into the sacred organization of the gentes. It appears that one attempt was made in this direction. The question of debts, which agitated Rome at this period, can only be explained if we see in it the more grave question of clientship and slavery. The Roman plebs, robbed of their lands, were no longer able to support themselves. The patricians calculated that, by the sacrifice of a little money, they could bring this poor class into their hands. The plebeian began to borrow. In borrowing, he gave himself up to the creditor, sold himself. It was so much a sale that it was a transaction per eis et liberam, that is to say, with the solemn formality which was commonly employed to confer upon man the right of property in any object. The plebeian, it is true, took security against slavery. By a sort of fiduciary contract, he stipulated that he should retain his rank of freeman until the day of the payment, and that on that day he should recover full possession of himself on paying the debt. But on that day, if the debt was not paid, he lost the benefit of his contract. He was in the power of his creditor, who took him to his house and made him his client and servant. In all this, the creditor did not think he was committing any act of inhumanity, the ideal of society being, in his eyes, the government of the gens. He saw nothing more legitimate or commendable than to bring men into it by any means possible. If this plan had succeeded, the plebs would have disappeared in little time, and the Roman city would have been nothing but an association of patrician gentes, sharing among them a multitude of clients. But this clientship was a chain which the plebeian held in horror. He fought against the patrician who, armed with his debt, wished to make a client of him. Clientship was for him equivalent to slavery. The patrician's house was, in his eyes, a prison, ergastulum. Many a time the plebeian, seized by the patrician, called upon his associates and stirred up the plebeians, crying that he was a free man, and displaying the wounds which he had received in the defense of Rome. The calculation of the patricians only served to irritate the plebs. They saw the danger, and strove with all their energy to free themselves from this precarious state, in which the fall of the royal government had placed them. They wished to have laws and rights. But it does not appear that these men aspired at first to share the laws and rights of the patricians. Perhaps they thought, with the patricians themselves, that there could be nothing in common between the two orders. No one thought of civil and political equality. That the plebeians could raise themselves to the level of the patricians never entered the minds of the plebeian of the first centuries any more than it occurred to the patrician. Far, therefore, from claiming equality of rights and laws, these men seem to have preferred at first complete separation. In Rome, they found no remedy for their sufferings. They saw but one means of escaping from their inferiority. This was to depart from Rome. The historian has well expressed their thoughts when he attributes this language to them. Since the patricians wish to possess the city alone, let them enjoy it at their ease. For us, Rome is nothing. We have neither hearths, nor sacrifices, nor country. We only leave a foreign city. No hereditary religion attaches us to this place. Every land is good for us. Where we find liberty, there shall be our country. And they went to take up their abode on the sacred mount, beyond the limits of the Ager Romanus. In view of such an act, the Senate was divided in opinion. The more ardent of the patricians showed clearly that the departure of the plebs was far from afflicting them. Thenceforth the patricians alone would remain at Rome, with the clients that were still faithful to them. Rome would renounce its future grandeur, but the patricians would be masters there. They would no longer have the plebeians to trouble them, to whom the rules of ordinary government could not be applied, and who were an embarrassment to the city. They ought perhaps to have been driven out at the same time with the kings, but since they had of themselves taken the resolution to depart, the patricians ought to let them go, and rejoice at their departure. But others, less faithful to old principles, or solicitous for the grandeur of Rome, were afflicted at the departure of the plebs. Rome would lose half its soldiers. What would become of it in the midst of the Latins, Sabines, and Etruscans, all enemies? The plebs had good qualities. Why could not these be made use of for the interests of the city? These senators desired, therefore, at a cost of a few concessions, of which they did not perhaps see all the consequences, to bring back to the city those thousands of arms that had made the strength of the legions. On the other side, the plebs perceived, at the end of a few months, that they could not live upon the sacred mount. They procured indeed what was materially necessary for existence, but all that went to make up an organized society was wanting. They could not found a city there because they could not find a priest who knew how to perform the religious ceremony of the foundation. They could not elect magistrates, for they had no prytaneum, with its perpetual fire, where the magistrate might sacrifice. They could find no foundation for social laws, since the only laws of which men then had any idea were derived from the patrician religion. In a word, they had not among them the elements of a city. The plebs saw clearly that by being more independent they were not happier, that they did not form a more regular society than at Rome, and that the problem, whose solution was so important to them, was not solved. They had gained nothing by leaving Rome. It was not in the isolation of the sacred mount that they could find the laws and the rights to which they aspired. It was found, therefore, that the plebs and patricians, though they had almost nothing in common, could not live without each other. They came together and concluded a treaty of alliance. This treaty appears to have been made on the same terms as those which terminate a war between two different peoples. Plebeians and patricians were indeed neither the same people nor the same city. By this treaty the patrician did not agree that the plebeian should make a part of the religious and political city. It does not appear that the plebs demanded it. They agreed merely that in the future the plebs, having been organized into something like a regular society, should have chiefs taken from their own number. This is the origin of the tribuneship of the plebs, an entirely new institution which resembled nothing that the city had known before. Power of the tribunes was not of the same nature as the authority of the magistrates. it was not derived from the city worship. The tribune performed no religious ceremony. He was elected without the auspices, and the consent of the gods was not necessary to create him. He had neither curule chair, nor purple robe, nor crown of leaves, nor any of those insignia which, in all the ancient cities, designated magistrates and priests for the veneration of men. He was never counted among the Roman magistrates. What then was the nature, and what was the principle of his power? Here we must banish from our minds all modern ideas and habits, and transport ourselves as much as possible into the midst of the ideas of the ancients. Up to that time, men had understood political authority only as an appendage to the priesthood. Thus, when they wished to establish a power that was not connected with worship, and chiefs who were not priests, they were forced to resort to a singular device. For this, the day on which they created the first tribune, they performed a religious ceremony of peculiar character. Historians do not describe the rites. They merely say that the effect was to render these first tribunes sacrosancti. Now these words signified that the body of the tribune should be reckoned thenceforth among the objects which religion forbade to be touched, and whose simple touch made a man unclean. Thus it happened, if some devout Roman, some patrician, met a tribune in the public street, he made it a duty to purify himself on returning home, as if his body had been defiled simply by the meeting. This sacrosanct character remained attached to the tribune during the whole term of his office. Then, in creating his successor, he transmitted the same character to him, just as the consul, in creating other consuls, passed to them the auspices and the power to perform the sacred rites. Later, the tribuneship having been interrupted during 2 years, it was necessary, in order to establish the new tribunes, to renew the religious ceremony which had been performed on the sacred mount. We do not sufficiently understand the ideas of the ancients to say whether this sacrosanct character rendered the person of the tribune honorable in the eyes of the patricians, or marked him, on the contrary, as an object of malediction and horror. The second conjecture is more in accordance with probability. What is certain is that in every way the tribune was inviolable. The hand of a patrician could not touch him without grave impiety. A law conferred and guaranteed this inviolability. It declared that no person should use violence towards a tribune, or strike him, or kill him. It added that whoever committed one of these acts against a tribune should be impure, that his property should be confiscated to the profit of the temple of Ceres, and that one might kill him with impunity. The law concluded in these words, whose vagueness powerfully aided the future progress of the tribuneship. No magistrate or private person shall have the right to do anything against a tribune. The citizens took an oath by which they agreed always to observe this strange law, calling down upon their heads the wrath of the gods if they violated it, and added that whoever rendered himself guilty of an attempt against a tribune should be tainted with the deepest impurity. This privilege of inviolability extended as far as the body of the tribune could extend its direct action. If a plebeian was maltreated by a consul who condemned him to imprisonment, or by a creditor who laid hands on him, the tribune appeared, placed himself between them, intercessio, and stayed the patrician hand. Who would have dared to do anything against a tribune, or to expose himself to be touched by him? But the tribune exercised this singular power only where he was present. Out of his presence, plebeians might be maltreated. He had no power over what took place beyond the reach of his hands, of his sight, of his word. The patricians had not given the plebeians rights. They had only agreed that certain ones among them should be inviolable. Still, this was enough to afford some security to all. The tribune was a sort of living altar to which the right of refuge was attached. The tribunes naturally became the chiefs of the plebs, and assumed the power of deciding causes for them. They had not, it is true, the right of citing before them even a plebeian, but they could seize upon a person. Once in their hands, the man obeyed. It was sufficient even to be found within the circle where their voice could be heard. This word was irresistible, and a man had to submit, even if he were a patrician or a consul. The tribune had no political authority. Not being a magistrate, he could not convoke the curies or the centuries. He could make no proposition in the Senate. It was not supposed in the beginning that he could appear there. He had nothing in common with the real city, that is to say, with the patrician city, where men did not recognize any authority of his. He was not the tribune of the people, he was the tribune of the plebs. There were then, as previously, two societies in Rome, the city and the plebs, the one strongly organized, having laws, magistrates, and a senate, the other a multitude which remained without rights and laws, but which found in its inviolable tribunes protectors and judges. In succeeding years we can see how the tribunes took courage, and what unexpected powers they assumed. They had no authority to convoke the people, but they convoked them. Nothing called them to the Senate. They sat at first at the door of the chamber. Later they sat within. They had no power to judge the patricians. They judged them and condemned them. This was the result of the inviolability attached to them as sacrosancti. Every other power gave way before them. The patricians were disarmed the day they had pronounced with solemn rites that whoever touched a tribune should be impure. The law said, "Nothing shall be done against a tribune." If then this tribune convoked the plebs assembled, and no one could dissolve this assembly, which the presence of the tribune placed beyond the power of the patricians and the laws. If the tribune entered the Senate, no one could compel him to retire. If he seized a consul, no one could take the consul from his hand. Nothing could resist the boldness of a tribune. Against a tribune, no one had any power except another tribune. As soon as the plebs thus had their chiefs, they did not wait long before they had deliberative assemblies. These did not in any manner resemble those of the patricians. The plebs, in their comitia, were distributed into tribes. The domicile, not religion or wealth, regulated the place of each one. The assembly did not commence with a sacrifice. Religion did not appear there. They knew nothing of presages, and the voice of an augur or a pontiff could not compel men to separate. It was really the comitia of the plebs, and they had nothing of the old rules or of the religion of the patricians. True, these assemblies did not at first occupy themselves with the general interests of the city. They named no magistrates and passed no laws. They deliberated only on the interests of their own order, named the plebeian chiefs, and carried plebiscita. There was at Rome for a long time a double series of decrees, senatus consulta for the patricians, plebiscita for the plebs. The plebs did not obey the senatus consulta, nor the patricians the plebiscita. There were two peoples at Rome. These two peoples, always in the presence of each other, and living within the same walls, still had almost nothing in common. A plebeian could not be consul of the city, nor a patrician tribune of the plebs. The plebeian did not enter the assembly by curies, nor the patrician the assembly of the tribes. They were two peoples that did not even understand each other, not having, so to speak, common ideas. If the patrician spoke in the name of religion and the laws, the plebeian replied that he did not know this hereditary religion, or the laws that flowed from it. If the patrician alleged a sacred custom, the plebeian replied in the name of the law of nature. They reproached each other with injustice. Each was just according to his own principles, and unjust according to the principles and beliefs of the other. The assembly of the Curies and the reunion of the Patres seemed to the plebeian odious privileges. In the assembly of the tribes, the patricians saw a meeting condemned by religion. The consulship was, for the plebs, an arbitrary and tyrannical authority. The tribuneship, in the eyes of the patrician, was something impious, abnormal, contrary to all principles. He could not understand this sort of chief, who was not a priest, and who was elected without auspices. The tribuneship deranged the sacred order of the city. It was what a heresy is in religion. The public worship was destroyed. "The gods will be against us," said a patrician, "so long as we have among us this ulcer which is eating us up and which extends its corruption to the whole social body." The history of Rome during a century was filled with similar discords between these two peoples, who did not seem to speak the same language. The patricians persisted in keeping the plebs without the body politic, and the plebs established institutions of their own. The duality of the Roman population became, from day to day, more manifest. And yet there was something which formed a tie between these two peoples. This was war. The patricians were careful not to deprive themselves of soldiers. They had left to the plebeians the title of citizens, if only to incorporate them into the legions. They had taken care, too, that the inviolability of the tribunes should not extend outside of Rome, and for this purpose had decided that a tribune should never go out of the city. In the army, therefore, the plebs were under control. There was no longer a double power. In presence of the enemy, Rome became one. Then, thanks to the custom, begun after the expulsion of the kings, of assembling the army to consult on public interests and on the choice of magistrates, there were mixed assemblies, where the plebeians appeared by the side of the patricians. Now we see clearly in history that the comitia by centuries became more and more important, and became insensibly what were called the great comitia. Indeed, in the conflict which sprang up between the assembly by curies and the assembly by tribes, it seemed natural that the comitia centuriata should become a sort of neutral ground, where general interest would be debated. The plebeian was not always poor. Often he belonged to a family which was originally from another city, which was there rich and influential, and whom the fate of war had transported to Rome without taking away his wealth, or the sentiment of dignity that ordinarily accompanies it. Sometimes, too, the plebeian had become rich by his labor, especially in the time of the kings. When Servius had divided the population into classes according to their fortunes, some plebeians belonged to the first class. The patricians had not dared, or had not been able, to abolish this division into classes. There was no want of plebeians, therefore, who fought by the side of the patricians in the foremost ranks of the legion, and who voted with them in the first centuries. This class, rich, haughty, and prudent as well, who could not have been pleased with disturbances, and must have feared them, who had much to lose if Rome fell, and much to gain if it prospered, was a natural mediator between the two hostile orders. It does not appear that the plebs felt any repugnance at seeing distinctions of wealth established among them. 36 years after the establishment of the tribuneship, the number of tribunes was increased to 10, that there might be 2 for each of the 5 classes. The plebs then accepted and clung to the division which Servius had established. And even the poorer portion, which was not comprised in the classes, made no complaint. It left the privileges to the wealthier, and did not demand its share of the tribunes. As to the patricians, they had little fear of the importance which wealth assumed, for they also were rich. Wiser or more fortunate than the eupatrids of Athens, who were annihilated on the day that the direction of affairs fell to the rich, the patricians never neglected agriculture, or commerce, or even manufactures. To increase their fortunes was always their great care. Labor, frugality, and good speculations were always their virtues. Besides, every victory over an enemy, every conquest, increased their possessions, and so they saw no great evil in uniting power and wealth. The habits and character of the nobles were such that they could not feel contempt for a rich man even though he was a plebeian. The rich plebeian approached them, lived with them, and many relations of interest and friendship were established. This perpetual contact brought about a change of ideas. The plebeian made the patrician understand, little by little, the wishes and the rights of his class. The patrician ended by being convinced. Insensibly, he came to have a less firm and haughty opinion of his superiority. He was no longer so sure about his rights. Now, an aristocracy, when it comes to doubt that its empire is legitimate, either no longer has the courage to defend it, or defends it badly. As soon as the prerogatives of the patricians were no longer an article of faith for them, this order might be said to be half vanquished. The rich men appear to have exercised an influence of another kind on the plebs, from whom they sprang, and from whom they did not yet separate. As they desired the greatness of Rome, they wished for the union of the two orders. Besides, they were ambitious. They calculated that the absolute separation of the two orders forever limited their own career, by chaining them forever to the inferior class, whilst a union would open a way to them, the end of which they could not see. They tried, therefore, to give the ideas and wishes of the plebeians another direction. Instead of persisting in forming a separate order, instead of making laws for themselves which the other order would never recognize, instead of working slowly by plebiscita to make a species of laws for their own use, and to prepare a code which would have no official value, they inspired the plebs with the idea of penetrating into the patrician city, and sharing its laws, institutions, and dignities. From that time the desires of the plebs turned to a union of the two orders on the condition of equality. The plebs, once started in this direction, began to demand a code. There were laws at Rome, as in all cities, unchangeable and holy laws, which were written, and the text of which was preserved by priests. But these laws, which were a part of the religion, applied only to the members of the religious city. The plebeians had no right to know them, and we may believe that they had no right to claim their protection. These laws existed for the curies, for the gentes, for the patricians and their clients, but not for others. They did not recognize the right to hold property in one who had no sacra. They granted justice to no one who had not a patron. It was the exclusively religious character of the law that the plebs wished to abolish. They demanded not only that the laws should be reduced to writing and made public, but that there should be laws that should be equally applicable to the patricians and themselves. The tribunes wished at first, it appears, that the laws should be drawn up by the plebeians. The patricians replied that apparently the tribunes were ignorant of what a law was, for otherwise they would not have made such a claim. "It is a complete impossibility," said they, "for the plebeians to make laws. You who have no auspices, you who do not perform religious acts, what have you in common with sacred things, among which the laws must be counted?" This notion of the plebeians appeared monstrous to the patricians, and the old annals, which Livy and Dionysius of Halicarnassus consulted in this part of their histories, mention frightful prodigies, heavens on fire, spectres leaping in the air, and showers of blood. The real prodigy was that the plebeians thought of making laws. Between the two orders, each of which was astonished at the persistence of the other, the republic remained 8 years in suspense. Then the tribunes made a compromise. "Since you are unwilling that the laws should be written by the plebeians," they said, "choose the legislators in the two orders." By this they thought that they were conceding a great deal, but it was little according to the rigorous principles of the patrician religion. The Senate replied that it was in no way averse to the preparation of a code, but that this code could be drawn up only by patricians. Finally, they found a means of conciliating the interests of the plebs with the religious requirements on which the patricians depended. They decided that the legislators should all be patricians, but that their code, before being promulgated and put in force, should be exhibited to the eyes of the public and submitted to the approbation of all classes. This is not the moment to analyze the code of the decemvirs. It is only necessary at present to remark that the work of the legislators, primarily exposed in the forum and freely discussed by all the citizens, was afterwards accepted by the Comitia Centuriata, the assembly in which the two orders were confounded. In this there was a grave innovation. Adopted by all the classes, the law thenceforth was applied to all. We do not find, in what remains to us of the code, a single word that implies any inequality between the plebeian and the patrician, either in the rights of property, or in contracts and obligations, or in legal proceedings. From that moment, the plebeian appeared before the same tribunal as the patrician, proceeded in the same manner, and was judged according to the same law. Now, there could not have been a more radical revolution. The daily usages, the manners, the sentiments of man towards man, the idea of personal dignity, the principles of law, all were changed in Rome. As there remained laws to make, new decemvirs were appointed, and among them were 3 plebeians. Thus, after it had been proclaimed with so much energy that the making of laws belonged to the patrician class, so rapid was the progress of ideas that at the end of a year plebeians were admitted among the legislators. The manners tended towards equality. Men were upon an incline where they could no longer hold back. It had become necessary to make a law forbidding marriage between the two orders, a certain proof that religion and manners no longer sufficed to prevent this. But hardly had they had time to make the law when it fell before an almost universal reprobation. A few patricians persisted, indeed, in calling upon their religion. Our blood will be attainted, and the hereditary worship of every family will be destroyed by it. No one will any longer know of what race he is born, to what sacrifices he belongs. It will be the overthrow of all institutions, human and divine. The plebeians did not heed these arguments, which appeared to them mere quibbles without weight. To discuss articles of faith before men who had no religion was time lost. Besides, the tribunes replied very justly, "If it is true that your religion speaks so loud, what need have you of this law? It is of no account. Withdraw it. You remain as free as before, not to ally yourselves with plebeian families." The law was withdrawn. At once marriages became frequent between the two orders. The rich plebeians were so sought after that, to speak only of the Licini, they allied themselves with 3 of the patrician gentes, the Fabii, the Cornelii, and the Manlii. It could then be seen that the law had been for a moment the only barrier which separated the two orders. Thenceforth the patrician blood and plebeian blood were mingled. As soon as equality was conquered in private life, the great difficulty was overcome, and it seemed natural that equality should also exist in politics. The plebs then asked why the consulship was closed to them, and they saw no reason why they should be withheld from it. There was, however, a very potent reason. The consulship was not simply a command, it was a priesthood. To be a consul, it was not sufficient to offer guarantees of intelligence, of courage, of probity. The consul must also be able to perform the ceremonies of the public worship. It was necessary that the rites should be duly observed, and that the gods should be satisfied. Now, the patricians alone possessed the sacred character which permitted them to pronounce the prayers, and to call down the divine protection upon the city. The plebeian possessed nothing in common with the worship. Religion, therefore, forbade him to be consul. Nefas plebium consulum fieri. We may imagine the surprise and indignation of the patricians when plebeians claimed for the first time the right to be consuls. Religion itself appeared to be menaced. The nobles took a great deal of pains to make the plebs understand this. They told them how important religion was to the city, that religion had founded the city, and that it presided over all public acts, directed the deliberative assemblies, and gave the republic its magistrates. They added that this religion was, according to ancient customs, more maiorum, the patrimony of the patricians, that its rites could be known and practiced only by them, and, in fine, that the gods would not accept the sacrifice of a plebeian. To propose to have plebeian consuls was to wish to suppress the religion of the city. Thenceforth the worship would be impure, and the city would no longer be at peace with the gods. The patricians used all their influence and all their address to keep the plebeians from the magistracies. They were defending at the same time their religion and their power. As soon as they saw that the consulship was in danger of falling into the hands of plebeians, they separated from it the religious function which was the most important of all, that which consisted in making the lustration of the citizens, and thus the censorship was established. At the moment when it seemed impossible to resist the claims of the plebeians, the consulship was replaced by the military tribuneship. But the plebs showed great patience. They waited 75 years before their hopes were realized. It is clear that they displayed less ardor in obtaining the high magistracies than they had shown in conquering the tribuneship and a code. If the plebs were somewhat indifferent, there was a plebeian aristocracy that was ambitious. Here is a legend of this period. Fabius Ambustus, one of the most distinguished of the patricians, had married his two daughters, one to a patrician, who became a military tribune, the other to Licinius Stolo, a prominent plebeian. This plebeian's wife was, one day, at the house of her sister, when the lictors, conducting the military tribune to his house, struck the door with their fasces. As she was ignorant of this usage, she showed signs of fear. The laughter and the ironical questions of her sister showed her how much a plebeian marriage had degraded her by placing her in a house where dignities and honors could never enter. Her father guessed her cause of trouble and consoled her by promising that she should see at her own house what she had seen at her sister's. He planned with his son-in-law, and both worked with the same object in view. This legend teaches us two things. One, that the plebeian aristocracy, by living with the patricians, shared their ambitions and aspired to their dignities. The other, that there were patricians who encouraged and excited the ambition of this new aristocracy, which was united with them by the closest ties. It appears that Licinius and Sextius, who was joined with him, did not calculate that the plebs would make great efforts to gain the right of being consuls, for they thought it necessary to propose 3 laws at the same time. The one, the object of which was to make it imperative that one of the consuls should be chosen from the plebs, was preceded by 2 others, one of which diminished the debts, and the other granted lands to the people. The 2 first, it is evident, were intended to warm up the zeal of the plebs in favor of the third, For a moment the plebs were too clear-sighted. They fell in with the laws that were for them, the reduction of debts and the distribution of lands, and gave little heed to the consulship. But Licinius replied that the three laws were inseparable, and that they must be accepted or rejected together. The Roman constitution authorized this course. Very naturally, the plebs preferred to accept all rather than to lose all. But it was not enough that the plebs wished to make these laws. It was also necessary at that time that the Senate should convoke the great comitia, and should afterwards confirm the decree. It refused for 10 years to do this. Finally, an event took place which Livy has left too much in the shade. It appears that the plebs took arms, and that a civil war raged in the streets of Rome. The Patricians, when conquered, approved and confirmed in advance by a senatus consultum all the decrees which the people should pass during that year. Now, nothing prevented the tribunes from passing their three laws. From that time the plebs had every year one of the two consuls, and they were not long in succeeding to other magistracies. The plebeian wore the purple dress, and was preceded by the fasces. He administered justice, he was a senator, he governed the city, and commanded the legions. Priesthoods remained, and it did not seem as if these could be wrested from the patricians. For in the old religion it was an unchangeable dogma that the right of reciting the prayers and of touching sacred objects was transmitted with the blood. The knowledge of the rites, like the possession of the gods, was hereditary. In the same manner as the domestic worship was a patrimony in which no foreigner could take part, the worship of the city also belonged exclusively to the families that had formed the primitive city. Assuredly, in the first centuries of Rome, it would not have entered the mind of anyone that a plebeian could be a pontiff, but ideas had changed. The plebeians, by taking from religion its hereditary character, had made a religion for their own use. They had made for themselves domestic lares, altars in public squares, and a hearth for the tribes. At first the patricians had nothing but contempt for this parody upon their religion, but with the lapse of time it became a serious thing, and the plebeian came to believe that, even as to the worship of the gods, he was equal to the patrician. Here were two opposing principles in action. The patrician persisted in declaring that the sacerdotal character and the right of adoring the divinity were hereditary. The plebs freed religion and the priesthood from the old hereditary character and maintained that every man was qualified to pronounce prayers, and that, provided one was a citizen, he had the right to perform the ceremonies of the city worship. He thus arrived at the conclusion that a plebeian might be a priest. If the priestly offices had been distinct from the military commands and from politics, it is possible that the plebeians would not have coveted them so ardently. But all these things were confounded. The priest was also a magistrate. The pontiff was a judge. The augur could dissolve the public assemblies. The plebeians did not fail to perceive that, without the priesthoods, they had not really civil or political equality. They therefore claimed that the pontificate should be shared by the two orders, as the consulship had been. It became difficult to allege their religious incapacity as an objection, since, for 60 years, plebeians had been seen, as consuls, performing the sacrifices, as censors, making the illustrations, as conquerors of the enemy, fulfilling the sacred formalities of the triumph. Through the magistracies, the plebs had already gained possession of a part of the priestly offices. It was not easy to save the rest. Faith in the hereditary principle of religion had been destroyed among the patricians themselves. In vain a few among them invoked the ancient rules, declaring, "The worship will be changed and sullied by unworthy hands. You are attacking the gods themselves. Take care that their anger is not felt against our city." It does not seem that these arguments had much influence with the plebs, or even that a majority of the patricians were moved by them. The new manners gave the advantage to the plebeian principle. It was decided, therefore, that half of the pontiffs and augurs should, from that time, be chosen among the plebs. This was the last conquest of the lower orders. They had nothing more to wish for. The patricians had lost even their religious superiority. Nothing distinguished them now from the plebs. The name patrician was now only a souvenir. The old principle upon which the Roman city, like all ancient cities, had been founded, had disappeared. Of this ancient hereditary religion, which had so long governed men, and which had established ranks among them, there now remained only the exterior forms. The plebeian had struggled against it for 4 centuries, under the Republic and under kings, and had conquered.